send it to the YouTube. And we did this last night, and people joined us from the YouTubes and they had questions, and it was awesome. So we felt very multi-scalar. So also we've been talking, it's super fun for me to have another geographer around as we think about things like scale. So something we've been talking about in this class is that we're in St. Paul, which is the capital city of Minnesota. So often it's easy to think about your town or city and your state and the country, but we also have a pretty significant county infrastructure, and then we have a regional municipality, kind of like it's a consortium of a bunch of counties, but also a bunch of municipalities within those counties that actually do things like tax redistribution, so that we don't have as bad a problem as we would with equity relative to zip code and school districts, for example, that coordinate transit and sewage, that coordinate to some degree urban growth and the servicing of municipal boundaries, and that work even between Wisconsin and Minnesota, which is somewhat rare at a planning municipal scale to think, how are things going to influence like what happens here, what goes on there. So is there somebody who would like to start our circle today as we talk about how we engage with environments and how we think we will as we move into the future? Thank you, Liam.
I can go first.
Awesome.
My name is Liam. I'm a senior studying sociology and environmental studies. It's something that I have been interested in recently. I have been doing research on climate change communication, how to best communicate about climate change, how what emotions are most effective to mobilize action.
And an idea you've picked up that you think you'll use on that?
Kind of meeting people where they're at instead of trying to like get them to where you are is really important. And that's some like the relationality kind of concept that we covered a lot in this class comes into play.
Can we come around?
Sorry, Josie.
My name is Josie. I'm a sophomore. I'm an environmental studies major. I'm really interested in human processes, like in relation to environment, like our whole system and relationship, what we're putting in and what we're putting out, and stuff like that. And so I think that the idea of global culture stuff is really interesting.
My name is Caden Erickson. I'm from Colfax, Wisconsin. I'm a junior here. I'm an environmental studies major, the biology minor, and a field study emphasis. So the only reason I mention like where I'm from is because like it's rooted in like a really rural area. Kind of coming into play like why I want to have that field study emphasis is just so I can work outside and obviously interact with different environments and stuff like that. But it's funny because I was just in your presentation earlier today, and you talked about ontology, and we've been talking about ontology, methodology, and axiology in the reading. Something that I'm picking up here is like how to get people involved with what you're saying. Kind of what Liam had mentioned, like meeting people where they're at instead of getting instantly to where you are. Like it's a continuing like working process, especially like me being so interested in working in the field and seeing different things firsthand, like hands-on. Just how can I get people to care? Obviously follow us, which is the climate crisis that we're currently.
I'm Lizzie. I'm a sophomore and I'm an environmental studies major with a minor in political science. Something I'm interested in is energy systems and how we can develop and better the energy systems that our world currently has in place, because humans are very reliant on energy. So finding ways to implement more sustainable energy sources is one of my goals, and something from this class that would help with that is kind of the relationships and having better communication about how to implement energy sources and making connections with people that have the power to change these types of systems.
I'm Emma. I'm a senior. I'm a public health major and a psychology minor. Something that I've been really interested in is health equity, food access, and something in the class that we've been doing is reading the Seven Chieftain book And it's important that what we do every single day has a huge impact overall. So like the basic things that we need can just like develop a bigger picture. And so what we do has a bigger impact. So it's been interesting to learn how like money, care, food, all of that can impact, you know, the rest of the future for everybody.
Hi, I'm Maddie. I'm a senior studying public health, environmental studies with a concentration in public policy. Something that I'm really interested in and that I plan to do my career in after I graduate is global water systems and global governance, specifically in regards to like climate change and sustainability. So understanding how those facets will impact our water systems, including like fresh water as well as like ocean and sea waters. That's something that I love. That's my passion. But within this class, our discussion of like systems and subsystems was really interesting to me last week, especially talking about the idea of like rivers and watersheds, like as systems and subsystems. So like specifically like the Mississippi River, the Mississippi River watershed. Within that is a subsystem of Mississippi River Critical Corridor Area, which is legislation to protect the river, the infrastructure, as well as to understand the best methods of growth moving forward, as well as, you know, potential for degrowth in certain areas to prevent fires.
Hi, I'm Xander. I'm studying global studies and data science. So I'm very interested in using the information that we have or that we could have to find pathways to solutions for our global problems. And something that I've learned from this class is kind of where our focus needs to be. Like there was this fictional example last class. It's like there are babies going down the river, and it's like going upstream to figure out why there are babies flowing down the river instead of just trying to get the problem fixed. So focusing on solving the root of problems instead of the symptoms.
I'm Sadie. I'm a public health major with a minor in religion. I'm not in this course, but I'm involved with CJL, so that's why I'm here. I am interested in sustainability, food access, and I hope to be a little bit more involved in advocacy work around like changing policies and that kind of stuff. I'm Abby. I'm a double degree computational data science and environmental studies. And the main thing that I make sure is just data in general. It's the thing I find myself going towards like anything. It's in everything. So, but for like the stuff in class, I think probably like the collaboration, talking to people, because I'm very much a lock myself in my room, hunched over at a desk, number crunching person. And I can't do it all the time.
I'm Henry. I'm a environmental studies and social justice, social change double major. And for me, like I care a lot about justice, obviously. So I think kind of finding out how to like change these like really harmful or just really like old kind of cultural ideas about, you know, the environment or about like equity and inequality is really interesting to me. Just how do you actually change that? Because you don't, when you try as hard as you want to change problems, but I think if you don't really change the culture around it, they're just gonna keep happening. So that's been interesting to me. And then I guess in regards to the class, something that I might use is like the glossary we made, the idea of like there are certain words that certain communities like might look at and they might take a totally different meaning. For them, I think is something I think a lot of people, especially academics, don't really think about sometimes, especially if they're doing like research. So just that idea is interesting to me, and it just shows like how important it is to be really considerate of other people. I mean, obviously just always, but especially when you're doing like research or really sensitive work, because like this is like real stuff that has real implications. So yeah, that's been interesting.
Rebecca, can I intervene just about glossary for a sec? I just want to note a few people are disproportionately adding to the glossary. So I want to encourage you. I noticed when I'm looking at your notes, many of you are thinking about vocabulary words. Can you make sure they get into our group glossary? And if you think of a word and somebody else has already put it there, check their definition. See if you think it could be a little better. If it's unclear, add a question in the comments or the notes, and I'll add a column if you want to +1 it, or like, yeah, this is an important one. I think that's a way to start, even if you don't have something to add, like, oh yeah, these are some that I think are really important. I'll come back to that on Tuesday. I just the public service announcement about our group translational glossary, because I do think it's a valuable tool.
All right, I'm Rebecca. I am a junior studying anthropology and environmental studies. And I'm really interested in just the ways that we as humans interact with our infrastructure systems and how we shape them and how they shape us and all of those kind of cultural interactions. And from class, I've been thinking a lot from Set of Cheap Things, especially the ways that we really commodify all of our resources and all of our actions and just kind of what those relationships look like.
My name is Katherine Ichinose. I am the St. Paul organizer for the Young Adult Coalition of ISAIAH. I graduated from St. Olaf last year. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is like how our sense of belonging and like permanence of home is connected to climate. And especially with like the way I've been thinking about this in the context of climate money, and there are so many federal grants and like billions and billions of dollars that are so much easier to use for like weatherization and retrofitting if you're a homeowner, rather than like if you're a renter who like might be moving next year, or a student, and like in also in the context of like building a collective power of young people among college students who like graduate every 4 years. And like maybe somebody gets engaged when they're a senior and then like are gone, and like where's the place for them to go into and like still maintain these relationships in a sustainable way that is cohesive and not like a million different opinions about a million different things, but can be strategic about like where are we putting our political pressure on to change things. And I think this is also kind of related to experiences around like the displacement and how climate change displaces people from their homes, and how can we find belonging and place and protect the places we love, even if like we're not going to be there permanently.
Maddie, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Okay. My name is Madeline. I'm a flex major with a focus in data analysis and sociology. Something I've been thinking about a lot. I had the opportunity to go to a campus sustainability conference that happened in South Dakota over the weekend. And one of the concepts that came up that I thought was like, I don't know, mind-blowing to me is the idea that like, when you think of like sustainability, like for lots of people that's like very like environmentally based, it's like nature based. But like one of the recurring themes that happened at the conference is that sustainability is also very social based. And so many of like people's identities are very tightly wrapped in how they react to conversations and topics and changes within the environment, both locationally and socially. So I'm super interested in that. And then one of the tips that came up in a workshop I had the privilege of attending was that like when you're talking about like a tough topic, it's important to leave room for acknowledging defensiveness, and then encouraging people to like step through that defensiveness rather than try to like bypass it or suppress it, because it helps you understand like where you're sitting in that conversation, and like helps you like regulate emotions a little bit better so you can be more perceptive and open to like critique that you didn't even think was going to be something you were critiqued on. So yeah, I thought that was super interesting.
Cool. I'm Valentine Cadieux, and I've read the readings for this class a number of times, but reading them again this semester in the context of our conversation, I think, especially working with Catherine, a piece of what's really struck me is this bridging capacity, that it's not enough to have these kind of social science analytic points. And I think one of my weaknesses is often I want to jump so quickly to action to say like, well, how can this change things? But it's made me appreciate how powerful having the analytic frameworks is for directing your action in a productive manner. And then the other thing that's really been striking me, especially reading the Wilson book, and I think this came up for a couple of you who were in the Concepts of Nature class this morning, where I gave a lecture, was there's this idea that's kind of gaining more legibility under the idea of like the multiverse. Like if you live in a world that, and I really love the word you brought in of worlding, like one of the ways in which we talk about ontology is that we bring the world into being. So like what we understand as being coexists with what other people understand as being, and our cultures understand the being of the world differently. And just the way in which we can navigate that more gracefully, and the privilege of living in a place with the cosmopolitanism of different cultures so that we see that happening regularly, it just feels really special. And especially, I mean, no shade on South Dakota, but like we went to a university where they aren't allowed to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like it's people talking about that get their programs defunded. It just really made coming back feel like a privilege that we have problems and we can talk about them and work on them with these analytic frameworks that we can put into action generally without fear of reprisal or punishment for that. So.
My name is Olivia. I am an environmental studies major with a minor in psychology. I'd say one of my main interests that I've kind of been developing is food access, but in terms of no longer relying on our like huge food system that provides food for us. I think one of the things that like was a huge culture shock for me when I first moved to Minnesota was like in the winter, and I like stepped foot into a grocery store and I found everything. Like you can get anything and everything, and it's in season all the time. And that concept is still just like super weird to me. So kind of just like, how do we no longer rely on this huge food system, whether that's like community gardens, local farms, or just like knowing what we can eat that's already around us. So yeah, I guess also to bring in the readings too, we just read the food section in History of the World, 7 Cheap Things. And as mentioned, like right at the end, like our food system is eventually going to falter. So I think we should be prepared to move away from it earlier than when it like is no longer a thing that can provide nutrition for us.
Hi, I'm Zoe. I'm an environmental studies major. I think what I've been thinking about in general, kind of with the various courses that I'm taking, everything I'm taking right now is in some way environmentally related, is the interconnectedness of everything, and also how just about everything in life is a cycle, like the carbon cycle, the environmental cycle, the cycle of the 7 cheap things in our book that we're reading. So that just sort of trying to think about the world and our education in that way of one step has consequences or victories down the line, I suppose, if that makes sense.
My name is Cece. I'm majoring in biology and environmental studies with institution policy. And I'm really interested in, for one, climate science, but also like bridging the gap between what we're discovering in science and what we're actually doing with policy, and like what's actually being put into action. And something that I've been thinking about a lot in the context of this class is like the 7 cheap things. These books that we're reading, they're very conceptual, and so learning about these systems is very important to like figure out where the best node of like creating change is, because you're actually finding where the problem is. But then also taking those big conceptual concepts of systems and like turning it into something that's more concrete is like something I've been thinking about a lot, especially in the context of working with the Young Coalition.
My name is Emily Yeh. I'm a professor of geography at the University of Colorado Boulder. I actually have no degrees in geography, so it's never too late. You know, hopefully you can use your majors and double majors and minors, but if you want to do something different, you can always do that too. So most of my work it's very driven, you know, by concerns about social and environmental justice. I work mostly in Tibet, on the Tibet Plateau. I've done a lot of work with pastoralists who raise livestock, and looking at some of the assumptions behind developmental policies, environmental policies, and kind of resettlement policies, so effects on them. I've done work on development and how people experience development, what they desire for development, and how, again, certain visions of development have been influenced on them. I've done work on the impacts of climate change on the Tibet Plateau and how it's affecting lives. Also indigenous knowledge, like what they observe. You know, some colleagues and I did some work on some scientific analyses of vegetation and then herders, you know, observations. And we try to argue that, you know, the right way to think about indigenous knowledge is not just to see if it's proven or disproven by science, right? But rather that bringing different knowledge systems together can actually advance and create new forms of knowledge, not to kind of elevate one above the other. I've done some work on environmentalism and concepts of nature. I'll be talking more about that tonight. You know, as an American citizen, it's hard to be involved in kind of local organizations there. I have worked with local organizations to try grassroots groups. It's a very different political system, of course, than here, and they're very constrained in terms of what they can do. I have had students who are from Tibet come and you know, through them, I can understand more kind of what the limits are for this sort of community involvement. For myself, and I should mention one more thing is, I've not done that much at the local level. I did go to COP last year, the Conference of the Parties, and so some observations about some international scale politics about climate, which I'd be happy to want to talk about. At the local level myself, things I've done mostly center around my campus and the AG, the American Association of Geographers. So on my campus, I've been, you know, trying to support students who want the university to divest from fossil fuels, and it's like a long, it's a very long process, there's some oil money in our state politics, and so it's something I've been very kind of invested in trying to engage. And then with the AAG, also, I've been really involved in trying to reduce climate impacts of our annual meeting, travel to our annual meeting. And I also am pretty upset at the food waste that we have at our annual meetings. And so hoping to find ways to intervene in that. So.
I'm Julia. I'm a sophomore and I'm majoring in environmental studies. And what I'm interested in, it changes a lot. I'm interested in a lot of things. So like public policy, math, data analysis, vision. And something that like I've learned is like environmental studies is such like an interdisciplinary like field of studies. So whatever that I end up doing, I know I can relate it back to environmental studies.
I'm Reese. I'm a double major in economics and environmental studies. I've been really interested lately, just looking at climate change, what's the one specific, like the rise of sea levels. I'm from Los Angeles, so I've really dived into how those rising sea levels can impact development, structure of coastal areas, things like that. So just one thing from the readings is just how kind of going back to what we said about cycles and stuff. Just capitalism as a whole, it's just one economic cycle. And this search for, you know, infinite gains or profits, maximizing that, but on this finite planet, for so long.
So for the conversation, really kind of anything we want to talk about. One of the things I wanted to make sure that we did cover was some of the conversation from last night, because it was super interesting, complementing your description of some of the specific wins. One of the things that was really most exciting to hear about was a strategy that legislators have asked folks who've been campaigning for environment stuff to help develop, to evaluate climate solutions that are proposed. So to help sort out the ones that are maybe the more greenwashing solutions from ones that would actually have positive impact. For those of you who were there, are there other highlights that or specifics you think folks would be interested in?
I really liked his bridge analogy. So he like made this analogy where like it's climate solutions. It's like a bridge, and if you only bridge or build a bridge halfway, you're still not going to get anywhere. And that's like the thing with climate solutions that aren't long term. It's like you're only getting halfway, but you need to go the entire way in order to actually get.
Yeah, and then if you put your resources into a bridge that gets you halfway across, it's maybe better to just save those resources until you could build a full bridge. That was very interesting. And one of the questions I kind of wanted to throw out there, like part of our goal today was to think about some of the really hyper local organizing we're doing, some of the what you've seen in different contexts, especially this. We haven't talked very much about developmentalism or like what the idea of development is, but it's definitely one of the things that's behind everything we're reading, is kind of imposition of this idea of modernity, and that we have to have roads, that they're like obviously a river should have a bridge over it rather than say, not sure if, did any of you participate in any of the St. Paul Public Art walks with Taran Perot? So there's a wonderful Indigenous Tara Perot who's a Dakota and Ojibwe plant woman, and she was describing how her grandmother ran a ferry service across the Minnesota River, and like just people crossed rivers before we had the whole road system. And so that kind of like these ideas, which we tend to use this idea of teleology, like obviously to get to its full manifestation, like a society needs roads. Like we were going to have roads, however we did this. And I was describing a little bit definitely the proposal from one of the first community events we did in the semester with the Our Streets folks who are saying, what would happen if we didn't have the highway between Minneapolis and St. Paul? What would be all the alternate modalities that would allow the movement between these places? So I'm really kind of curious in various people's experience, Emily's, but also yours, where you see kind of like either that assumption that we need to go in this direction, whether that's like we have to decarbonize, or obviously we keep needing to have more cars. Like where are those kind of ideas? Like modernity requires that we move forward, like, progress. I feel like your generation maybe hasn't been quite as under a constant pressure of like, well, that would be backwards. Like we have to go forwards. This idea of progress was, I think, a big deal in our generation.
It's a big deal in the so-called developing world, right? And, I think in other contexts outside the US, like in Nepal, people are called development, like they name their kids development. Vikash means development, right? That's like how strong it's become. And I think it's really easy when you argue against it for people to say, and this happens with ethnic minorities in China all the time, if you start to say, well, maybe they don't, maybe this is not a good idea. And then you get accused of like, oh, you just want to keep people in their, like in a zoo, right, to look at in there. And then so the issue is really like not development or not, but like on whose terms and what does it mean? And what kinds of meanings get associated with it. And so in Tibet, for example, people don't mind having some roads. I have a student from northern Nepal who has to walk 3 days to get home, and they would like a road, right? But on the other hand, there's, in China, there's excessive, right? Truly excessive numbers of roads. And then one of the ways in which people talk about development is through jokes, right? And so I remember talking to someone who, like, everything is explained to Tibetans as well. You need this to become more developed. You need to move out of your adobe houses where very nicely suited for the climate to these concrete houses, which are cold in the winter and hot in the summer because it's more developed. And people would joke to me like, soon we'll be so developed we won't even need to eat, and just sort of like saying all sorts of like expressing their dissatisfaction with it. But it's very strong within China still.
I heard a really parallel discussion on the radio after the earthquake in Morocco, where it was a engineer who'd been trained in London. So it was like very interesting use of cosmopolitan legitimacy. He's from Morocco. And, so he's the person who gets interviewed on the radio. And he was like, this isn't the story you want me to tell, but the effectively like adobe structures with wood beams that go through the walls, through holes. He's like, this was a technology that was adapted over a really long time of living in a seismically unstable place. And that, we've had a tremendous amount of mortality because people were pressured to move into concrete buildings that didn't hold up well.
That happened in Tibet as well with an earthquake.
I assume that must, yeah. And so there's that idea that like this thing works well, but the local knowledge, and part of what was really interesting in the radio, he was like, it's both not considered modern enough and it's something people won't pay for. Like it's cheaper to make concrete. So then why would you keep all these people in business that had a locally adaptive architecture system? It's like until you realize how expensive it is when everything falls down and you have to start from scratch. Oh, we have to train everybody.
I think that's been a kind of common theme in 17 Things. Is like the idea of learning from history. And that's also, I'm in environmental history, so is Rebecca and maybe another person or two in this course. And we've been reading a book called The Dose Map, which is about the cholera epidemic in London in the 1850s. But like just generally in a lot of environmental literature and environmental education, it's like the idea of learning from history and how very, very frequently, like I think it's one of the most important things we can do today, because a lot of the mistakes we've been making, like we don't need to be making, they were already made. Like learn from them now is a big thing. And I think that's part of like historical education is so important.
On the note of like costs and expensiveness, one thing that I've been noticing a lot, I've been doing a lot of work digging into like local budgets in St. Paul, and then also like we are getting a ton of money federally and from the state level. And the majority of that money which is like billions of dollars, is going to like repairs and weatherization and retrofitting and like road repairs, repairing old buildings. And sometimes it's, as you're tearing up this old building, maybe you're adding a heat pump or electrifying it. But it's been really striking how much money we are spending on fixing structures that are not climate resilient instead of like imagining climate resilient structures without those like existing buildings. And right before this, I had a meeting with the chief resilience officer for St. Paul, and he was talking about how one of the things that they wrestle with is that they are choosing to prioritize reducing carbon emissions over building climate resilient structures and buildings. And part of that is just like this necessity of crisis response to like the inequities around carbon emissions and like trying to invest in communities that are actively like right now being hurt by it. But that essentially local cities are underfunded, but like that leaves no budget left over to like actually build new climate resilient structures. I was just like interesting to see like where's our money going, and like why is it being sucked into these places when maybe there's a better use for it somewhere else.
One of the things I loved in the campus sustainability conference, the final keynote speaker was Heidi Brook. She's just in the last few years has been leading up a new climate adaptation partnership that's headquartered at the University of Minnesota. And part of what I love is that she's an infrastructure nerd. So she's been thinking a lot about like, how do we change the liability structures? How do we change like all the invisible levers that are behind the scenes? Because so one of the things she keeps saying is like, we need to change some of the workflows of engineers. And it's really hard to get them to think differently about things. But one of the questions she kept asking is, why aren't you building climate resilient buildings? And their big response is, no, none of our clients are asking for it. And so she was saying, at least at universities, at least at all the places where people are thinking about this, can we educate the people who are on the side of specifying new buildings? Because it's amazing, like a building like this, notice that none of the windows open. Like all of these buildings are based on the idea that you will have air forced through. And when the power goes out, the buildings have to be evacuated because we don't have airflow in the buildings. Who thought that was a good idea? Like, and that's, this is this little blip in the history of buildings, which you wouldn't have just automatically had some kind of ventilation for oxygen. Really basic, low level stuff. Like we're not talking, but I mean, it is kind of, we were talking about reduce, reuse, recycle as a hierarchy last night. And kind of the current action is, help me out, friends. It's decarbonize.
Electrify, decarbonize.
Yeah. So same, like the first one is when you have opening windows, or when you have windows, you don't need lights on. When you have opening windows, you don't need a whole HVAC system half of the time. We have a pretty windy climate. We push air through buildings. And then the idea is if you can move everything, as Katherine just said, to electricity and get your electricity on the decarbonized grid, those are your fastest actions. And part of what was really nice about last night is Peter Regenius really made a great case for how this is not just climate. At this point, the technology means this is saving people money first, and also then having all of these climate and pollution benefits. And so he was both helping share this knowledge, but also the meta knowledge of the way you communicate this stuff. That, if you start with that upbeat, like we have the tools in hand, we can do this, then you give people some momentum. You don't start on the like, this is too hard. And then part of what I thought was interesting in the more sophisticated details is then you're saving offsets or the mitigations, the more kind of like, well, some people are still going to use fossil fuels for heavy industry, for concrete and steel, for some of the areas that don't have transition technologies already in hand. And that helps, just changes the landmarks a little bit, the conversation. Other themes from last night people want to share, or other questions you might want to ask Emily while we have the honor of her presence here?
I mean, one thing I'll say that I was really struck with last night was also just, you mentioned this already, but making sure climate adaptation or mitigation is actually doing what it says it's doing. A really good example, not from my own research, but that I've been reading about is in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is really well known for its advocacy at the UNFCCC conferences for climate justice. So at a nation state scale, it does really well in terms of advocating for loss and damage. But within Bangladesh, the climate experts, many of which are a lot of foreign consultants, have really been pushing shrimp aquaculture as adaptation. So yeah, raising shrimp on former farmland. And the thing is that agrarian peasant movements have been opposing shrimp aquaculture for decades, because when you raise shrimp, you're salinizing the soil, and you kind of destroy livelihoods. And so in fact, some of the damage that's been blamed on climate change in Bangladesh is probably due to shrimp aquaculture. Shrimp aquaculture is also done by wealthier landowners who often grab land from poorer landowners and dispossess them of their land, making them migrants. So some climate migrants are actually kind of created actually from shrimp aquaculture. And then experts who don't know the landscape come in and say, oh, their land is ruined anyway. We're just gonna make shrimp aquaculture. So it's totally not adaptive, but and then the country gets loans that they have to pay back. So that's a pretty unfortunate example of adaptation that's not adaptive, but is labeled adaptation. And then the thing that we also talked about a little bit last night was carbon capture, use and storage just being really pushed as mitigation. But when you start to look into it, the biggest users are the oil industry. because they've been using it for decades for enhanced soil recovery. Like you have some carbon dioxide and you just inject it back in and you get part of mile out. So oil companies are super behind this. The US and China are the biggest players in this. There's all these plans to do lots of carbon capture in the US, especially places where there's already oil, and new pipelines. You know, and if you start to dig into the science, they don't know what happens underground. Like all their models are apparently wrong in terms of like once you put the gas in, where does it go? Does it leak out, right? And but you know, these carbon capture use and storage like schools are popping up. One of my students went to one, and you know, their whole thing is like, how can we convince the public that this is, you know, a good idea? So I think it's a big coming issue I care about, not just climate change, but climate justice.
And people become sort of like prophets of these specific technologies. There was an elderly scientist at U of M when I worked there that was obsessed. Like you bundled all of the corn stover with all of the leftover bits and you sunk them into the deep ocean. You thought you could, like that would be the way to get all the carbon back into the ocean. So you're like incentivizing removing every last iota of organic matter from cornfields that are already pretty stripped of their nutrient base. Isn't going to have any impacts in an ecosystem.
Much larger just so how is the ocean going to cycle that corn matter?
Right. Like again,
You said that the words and my brain just went,
but he, in every meeting that I ever was in with him, he would kind of take it over and be like, but no one is thinking about this technological solution that will be the solution. So I think
solar radiation management is more frightening. You know, and what's really interesting is there was supposed, you know, Harvard's really involved and they were going to do a test outdoors. And it was going to be over Sami land, right? Indigenous lands. And the idea was that it was empty. Nobody lived there, right? So you see all sorts of
I feel like a lot of this falls into like kind of a development paradox of like what we've created or what the capitalistic structure thinks development is. So like all of our solutions have to be capitalist developments that are like a new technology or a new building. Like when you were talking about this building, like there are solutions to this list of problems that already exist and make more logical sense, but they aren't forward, quote unquote. So they're like not seen as an option. And I think it's similar to what you were just talking about in Bangladesh of like, instead of, there are people that want to use this land and know how to farm this land, but that's not moving forward. So that's not what we can choose. So like, I feel like that's such a challenging thing because it goes against dealing with that problem, goes against meeting people where they are, which is at this, like, I don't know, if there's these two things that are both really important and for the most part meeting people where they are is easier, but unfortunately so many people are in this mindset of, well, forward is the best way, even though it's not.
Forward and making someone money, right?
Yes,
ultimately.
Yeah, that kind of moving forward.
Yeah, and you're talking about like developing technology, you're asking about like whether or not like our generation feels that like need to like progress. And like I'm like in a very like a STEM like area of people a lot of my time. And it's interesting that like there is this idea of like technological solutionism, that if we like really just work really hard and find all the solutions through science, we can just like figure our way out of this whole mess. And like, I don't believe in that. And I don't think anybody should believe that like purely science, we're going to figure it out. But like, we want to because it's an easy way out. And that's why like I feel like oil companies like with the carbon capture, they're almost playing into that like idea that we've developed with technological solutionism. That somehow like, oh, don't worry, like we will advance in some way and take ourselves out of this hole. So you should be putting your energy into that and not like the basic and obvious solutions that might not seem more like protection.
I'm really glad this conversation went to geoengineering because I was thinking about geoengineering one of the first things you said. I was like, I'm gonna wait till it gets there. And I'm glad it got here because I think like a lot of geoengineering, like carbon capture or SR or these other technocratic solutions that like perpetuate the status quo and don't actually, or like ethanol gas, don't actually cause any of these systems that got us to this crisis in the first place. It doesn't force them to change, it just allows them to keep doing what they're doing under the guise of we're doing it better now. And I think that, like, with these solutions, I think that, I don't know how this would happen, but there needs to be a more democratic, because like with SRM, for example, like when the second you start using it, like you have to keep using it, and it's just you're stuck in that, and then the second you stop using it, like temperatures skyrocket immediately.
Especially if you don't use it as a bridge to get yourself decarbonized.
Totally. So it's like, how do we make sure these processes that determine what are solutions that we're investing in and what are solutions that are dead end pathways, like Julia talked about? How do you make sure those processes and conversations are democratic and inclusive and equitable and justice oriented?
So I'm curious, one of the places I've seen the most hope disciplinarily, and I'm curious if anyone has come across this because I have not in the US, like this is all stuff I've seen in Eastern Canada and Europe, is a real shift to human-centered design. And like a lot of the work is around changing infrastructure. So for example, one of the books I've been thinking about is like Design for the Multiverse. Because I do think these moments where you think about these different kinds of technologies or sciences or strategies of inquiry having commensurate legitimacy, like where people are like, oh yeah, we could do it this way, but like we could do it this way. Because I feel like food sovereignty has gained a tremendous amount of buy-in in the last 10 years because people have seen how much food is produced in the informal economy. And it's like, oh, you know, and large scale collapses, like when Estonia and Latvia had a huge currency collapse and their pig factories stopped running, which people were like, oh, everyone's going to starve. But it turned out they had a large enough gray market economy where people were producing yogurt and small farms and trading food. People are like, there's this famous Margaret Thatcher, this is kind of like one of the banners of neoliberalism, like there is no alternative. And it's like, oh, well, the multiverse tells us there are actually alternatives and they're thriving. So human-centered design.
There are always alternatives.
Totally, there are always alternatives. It was a great banner, partly because it was a banner to which people could resist so obviously.
Yeah.
But I think human-centered design I've seen used a lot to basically organize communities around like what are solutions that are not brought in from outside, that are not extracting money from this community, that are, you know, maybe not cheapening the people in that setting. Because I feel like the shrimp agriculture, one of the most powerful student papers I've ever had done in a class, a student from Bangladesh when I was teaching in Toronto wrote about this impact of shrimp aquaculture, but it was before Seven Cheap Things was written, but it used this analysis. It was like, the lever that has made this happen is that something that used to be a luxury food has been made a mass food, but nobody even enjoys it. Everyone dips it in effectively like horseradish ketchup. Like you almost never see shrimp. Like it's 90% of the shrimp you ever see at least it's like a medium for someone to
something else.
Right. That's like fundamentally like a corn syrup product. And she was like, you are destroying the mangrove ecosystem of the world. So you can eat more ketchup, like just eat ketchup on something else. And it was like a very sophisticated analysis of how a luxury food became cheap, but then was marketed to people as a way for them to feel like they're having a luxury food. But in a way that's so cheap, like it's so cheapening of the food, it's so cheapening of the ecosystem. And it's partly because that developmentalist hierarchy allows us to see it's like, well, at least it allows them to participate in like a global export economy, as if that's the only thing that exists. So human-centered design really, I think, often flips that. And I often am thinking, great, where can we help? Like one of my most helpful moments, there was a low impact design conference here in St. Paul. And I was just, one of the people driving people back to the end of the day because the here at St. Paul had asked a bunch of us to help. And there are people from, again, Canadian City, it was like, I think Winnipeg was talking about how they had put out a call for people to help them solve their problems. And in the end, they had decided not to go with the consulting firm that was all about solving problems. They had gone with an art firm that was all about problem opening, about getting your community understand more thoroughly where its problems were coming from. And I was trying not to get involved in the conversation because I was the driver, but being like, "Ooh," you're like going upstream to see why the babies are falling into the water. And I'm curious if you see, like, do you see those openings happening?
I mean, like, you're talking about like shrimp and how like there's been this narrative that's built that that shrimp is your only option for this luxury meal that you're gonna have. And like, I feel like this is a bigger, broader concept, but like oil PR companies have done the same thing of like oil and these like carbon, this dense carbon that we were receiving is the only way to get a bunch of energy. It's the only way to do these things. Like if you didn't have oil, you would like, society would collapse. And like, but part of that is true because we built it to be so dependent on oil, but that there is other alternatives and there is like more creative solutions that might not necessarily fall into that story that we've been creating. What's like what like technology and like progressing looks like. Instead, it might look like going back and using some solutions that we used to rely on.
I like this discussion of like alternatives. I'm watching Suits right now, and one of the main, I don't know any Suits fans in here, Harvey Specter. One of like the main things about Suits is that Harvey Specter always says is like, when someone has you backed into a corner with a gun to your head, don't do exactly what they say. There's always another option other than what they tell you to do. You just haven't thought of it yet. So like maybe we have thought of it or like and have like dismissed it as, oh, that's not forward, or oh, that's not the right solution, or it's too hard. So I think that like looking at those alternatives and like using those 5 question framework that you talked about last night of like asking like just not like fossil fuels and oil, but also asking those questions to like things that are peddlerless solutions that might not actually be solutions.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like how all of these kind of environmental concepts map onto organizing in so many powerful ways, and how we talk a lot about like elite capture and like how these elites who have backed us into a corner with a gun are like the oil CEOs who are making decisions that determine whether or not we have housing, whether or not we can afford transportation and food. And my question and like the project that we're embarking on with organizing here in St. Paul is like, how do we create a human-centered design of politics and co-governance where the decisions are not coming from a hierarchy of the elites handing down like, we got this research from these lobbyists and this is what we think is right, but it's rolling just like everyday ordinary people who the idea of like having political power is not something they're seeking and like is so unfathomable, and imagining like what does it look like if we build a collective power, do organized listening, build an organized agenda, build relationships with elected officials, and then work to advance something that actually reflects our wants and needs and not like what experts are saying is the climate solution, which is not always what is actually going to make our lives healthier.
There's a big bird outside. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out what it is and I'm failing.
It's a bird.
It's getting chased by another bird.
Sorry.
I mean, it's a bird prey of some kind because it just upset everything while it's flying through.
Thank you for bringing the more than human into our conversation. Well, so any final words as we wrap up class, especially from a quiet side of the room? No pressure.
I'll say it's really exciting to learn about all this community engagement. I was very depressed at the conference, honestly, and I just thought, if there's going to be action, it's not going to be at the international scale. It's got to happen locally. So, yeah.
And then you feel like the COP can become a place where people bring that local scale action and compare notes about it, like team up.
No, there is. I mean, but I will say also because it was in Egypt, a lot of the usual activism was not allowed to be there. And then, this year it's gonna be in Dubai, so that's even worse.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
And then there are gonna be more fossil fuel interests than developing countries at the COP, in terms of representatives there.
Even last year,
Which is great.
the number of fossil fuel lobbyists was bigger than any single country.
Wow, it's so backwards.
Good, good though, like they're impressive, smart.
Really useful to know what you're up against. Thank you both so much for continuing to animate our class. It's been really, really nice to engage with you. Will you help me in thanking our visitors? And I think that this has been kind of like a good chance to get to know what the Hamline Student Body is like before your talk. So we're really excited to hear that. For those of you who need a chance to go get something to eat, please do so. Please join us at 5. We'll be at Kate Frederick's Hall on the top of class. And we will have cookies and pot stickers and snacks at the beginning, first 10 minutes if you like.